If you followed me long enough, you've seen me use this video whenever I talk about American intervention in Latin America. And sometimes, mostly in the past, not so often now, whenever I would bring up these past military interventions, I would get told, get over it, that's in the past, it doesn't happen anymore. That happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, so on. But some of these interventions have actually been pretty recent. Matter of fact, I would say that this image here in particular is out of date. But one of the more recent instances of intervention shown here on this infographic is here in 2009 in Honduras. In 2009, Honduras had a constitutional crisis when President Manuel Zelaya planned to hold a referendum on holding a constitutional convention to see whether or not they would either rewrite the constitution or write an entirely new one. This was unpopular and it drew criticism not just from the Honduran Supreme Court, but other members of government, including people in Zelaya's own party. And part of the opposition to holding a constitutional convention to potentially rewrite Honduras' constitution was the fear that this could lead to presidential re-elections, something which is banned in Honduras. But despite this opposition from the government, it appeared as if Manuel Zelaya might move forward with holding a poll to gauge the interest of the Honduran people on whether or not they would support a constitutional convention. This would ultimately lead to the Supreme Court of the country issuing a secret arrest warrant for President Zelaya, resulting in approximately 100 soldiers storming the president's residence on the morning of June 28, 2009. At that point, President Zelaya was arrested and put on a plane where he was then flown and exiled in Costa Rica. Soon after, the National Congress then voted to remove Zelaya from office after having read a letter of resignation supposedly written by President Zelaya, which Zelaya himself denied writing, stating that it was a forgery. Soon after this, Roberto Micheletti, who was the head of Congress, was then put in place as interim president. I want you to remember this, and that's that the coup was sparked not by some sort of binding resolution or law or vote on whether or not to rewrite the Constitution, but a poll in which citizens would be asked whether they supported the possibility of putting a constitutional convention on the ballot in upcoming elections. And it'll also help to point out that Zelaya was also an ever so slightly left-leaning president. And thus he stepped on the toes of Honduras' oligarchs by doing things such as increasing the minimum wages of urban and rural workers to $290 and $213 a month, respectively. And thus this question of potentially holding a constitutional convention was spun by the nation's right wing as an attempt by Zelaya to abolish the limit on presidential re-elections and thus an attempt to make himself a dictator. All in justification to launch a coup against the president. And we started this video by talking about American intervention in Latin America, and so now you might be thinking, what does this at all have to do with the United States? Well, how did the United States respond to this coup? Well, the United States responded to the coup by simply not referring to it as a coup, failing to recognize it as a coup, because then this way they could provide aid to the Honduran people. And this aid came in the form of further financing police and military forces in Honduras, the same forces which had killed around 300 people after pro-Zelaya protests broke out after the president was deposed in the coup. And this includes 34, at least, members of the opposition who were either killed or disappeared. And that funding of Honduras' coup government was part of a strategy by Hillary Clinton's State Department to restore order to Honduras and ensure free and fair elections. Free and fair elections by supporting a coup government that overthrew a democratically elected president. It should also be noted that Clinton's State Department also worked behind the scene to stall military and economic efforts by OAS nations to restore President Zelaya to office, the office his people had elected him to. Instead, Hillary Clinton's State Department helped to organize elections where Zelaya, the previously democratically elected president, would be excluded from. This ultimately led to the right-wing president, Porfirio Lobo Sosa, being put in office. And one of the first things that this right-wing president did was sell out his country, stating that Honduras is open for business. And this, of course, was good. It was perfect for Honduras' oligarchs and multinational companies looking to exploit Honduras' natural resources as well as their labor. But it wasn't so good for regular, everyday Hondurans, especially marginalized communities within the country. It especially wasn't good for Hondurans who were actively seeking to protect their nation from exploitation. For instance, Berta Cáceres, who was a fierce defender of indigenous land rights and who was assassinated. Her name, according to an Honduran soldier, having appeared on a hit list belonging to U.S.-trained Honduran special forces. She was only one of many people who were targeted by government death squads, of course, funded and trained by the United States. And it also wasn't good for several communities, particularly indigenous communities in Honduras today, whose communities are being essentially sieged by multinationals such as the company Prospera. Because you see, after the 2009 coup, when the right-wing government opened up Honduras for business, it allowed companies like Prospera to enter Honduras and open up what they call their own economic development and employment zones that are essentially areas where these companies are allowed to create their own corporate cities. These special economic zones allow companies like Prospera to set up a local government outside of the jurisdiction of local municipal governments, allowing them to essentially set up their own tax laws, their own monetary policy, their own security forces, their own court systems, entirely separate from local Honduran municipal jurisdictions and governments. In other words, this is a clear violation of the sovereignty of the Honduran people. And a lot of this was done without the knowledge of the Honduran population. A lot of them didn't know this was happening until these economic zones essentially took over the regions. This ultimately resulted in resistance from the Honduran people, who did not want their sovereignty violated by foreign multinational corporations who sought to exploit not only them, but their nation as a whole. And this leads us now to the modern day, where the current Honduran president, Xiomara Castro, and her administration have repealed the law that allowed these multinational corporations to establish these economic zones, restoring sovereignty to the Honduran people. And as a result of President Castro seeking to protect Honduras from capitalist exploitation by multinational corporations, Prospera is now suing the government for $11 billion, which amounts to nearly 2/3 of the country's entire 2022 budget, essentially seeking to attempt to bankrupt the nation because it will not allow itself to be exploited. But it's not just Prospera, it's also the U.S. government, with 2 senators threatening to withhold foreign aid from the country if they do not allow themselves to be exploited through the creation of these special economic zones. So when I talk about American intervention in Latin America and how that affects migration from these countries into the United States because of the instability that intervention causes, know that that's not something that's happened 50, 30, 40 years ago and then never happened again. That's something that continues to this day. Neocolonialism continues to destabilize nations, not just in Latin America, but in Asia and Africa, leading to mass migration to countries like the United States with an attempt to demonize these people for seeking a better life in the land that is essentially stealing and pillaging their home countries. And by the way, the 2 senators threatening Honduras right now are Bill Hagerty, who's a Republican, and Ben Cardin, who's a Democrat. People of Honduras and other Latin American countries are entitled to their sovereignty. They need not continuously have to bend over backwards for empires such as the United States, who seek to exploit their natural resources and their people. And for those of you who talk about, well, why don't these people stay in their own country? Why do they have to seek asylum or migrate to the United States? This is because of actions by the United States such as this and American corporations such as Prospera, who continuously undermine these governments, who continuously go into our regions and destabilize our nations for the sole purpose of their own profits. If you want migration from Latin America to stop into the United States, it starts at home. This story hasn't been covered by a lot of large news outlets, so if you haven't heard of it, it's by design. They don't want you to hear about this. That's exactly why I want you guys to look into not just what's happening in Honduras right now with Prospera, but the various different American interventions in places like Latin America, in places like Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile, and Cuba, Venezuela. Well, you can follow me here because I sure as hell never stop talking about this. If you want to support the channel so I can keep putting out videos like this, go check out the Patreon.